In this tutorial, I'll show you how to paint these beautiful, expressive, loose watercolor roses in a few easy steps and using only one brush. So let's get started. So in today's video, I'll be sharing my process for painting this style of watercolor rose, which is a very expressive, full bloom type of rose. And this is a style I've only started painting very recently. I do have an in-depth class available online that teaches you how to paint my more traditional style roses that you can see on the screen, but what I'll be teaching in this tutorial is a little bit different as it has those fluffy skirting petals around the outside that really help to bring this rose to life. But if you enjoy this tutorial and you want to continue painting more roses, definitely check out that class. I'll have it linked for you down below along with all the supplies that I'm using today. Alright, so we're going to start practicing this rose 2 times. So the first one is just a warm-up, don't put too much pressure on yourself. And I've loaded up this color in my brush. I have a good amount loaded up just in the tip. Not too much where it's dripping off, but I have a decent amount. And I'm going to start by just using the very tip of my brush, and I'll just make very quick little wispy C strokes. So you can see there, it's just a very small mark, using only the tip of my brush and making little marks in the shape of a C. It's getting slightly thicker as I work my way out, and I'm making sure to leave plenty of white space in the middle. If you've taken my classes before, you know that I always talk about how important white space is. If you don't have white space in between your brush marks, then your flower is just going to turn into a blob. And we want to avoid that, so make sure you're being mindful of the white space. And I'm just going to add a few more marks here. I'm varying the pressure, so you can see that one was a little thicker, but some of them are thinner. And that'll serve as the center of my rose. So now what I'm going to do is rinse off my brush so that I only have clean bristles. And I'm going to soften out the edges of some of these. So just lining that very outer edge with clean water and dragging out some of that color. Just like that. And now you can start to see a little bit of depth building in the rose. So you have the dark in the middle, and then it's getting slightly lighter towards the outer petals. So I'm going to continue with the light values here, just using what's in my brush and adding a few more thick strokes out here. And I'm not being too intentional about making sure I put my brush down in the exact perfect spot and making these perfect C strokes. I'm just kind of letting my brush dance across the page, making little wispy strokes. And I'm going to make my final marks here. And I want to make sure that these ones are nice and wet, because when we add the outer skirting petals, I want them to bleed with these ones a little bit. But before we get to that, I like to just go back in one more time using heavily pigmented color mixture and just tap in a little more of that dark color in the very center to deepen it and get a little bit more of a bold contrast. And I'm being very gentle here. I don't want to flood the petals with too much color because I still want to get that nice loose effect. But you can see those gentle bleeds start to form, and I absolutely love that. And so now these outer petals are still wet, and I'm going to grab a medium value of my color, and this is where we'll start adding these skirting petals. So instead of the C strokes that are in this circular shape, I'm going to create a full petal starting with the tip of my brush, applying more pressure, and this petal is going completely downward. So I'm going to do a couple strokes to make it nice and thick. And you can see it's thin where it attaches to the center of the rose, and then it gets a lot thicker as it works its way out. And you'll see me use this wet on wet technique as I paint these outer petals. So after I add that first layer, I go back in and I just tap in a little additional color. And it just gives a really beautiful effect. And I'm actually going to add a little bit more color to the center rose too. I talk about this quite a bit in my classes. It's called intuitive painting, and so that's where I just kind of feel my painting out and see what strokes I think I need to make. I don't have an exact process and an exact step-by-step plan for every one of my paintings, but as I go, I just kind of determine what areas need a little more color, what needs blending out, what needs more contrast. It takes a little bit of practice and just experience painting different things, but that is, again, just called intuitive painting, and that's what I'm doing here. But now I can start adding more of these skirting petals. Again, starting with the tip of my brush, applying more pressure down, so you get a very nice thick outer part of that petal, and then tapping in some more color and getting those organic blooms. So I'm keeping my strokes nice and loose. I don't want too much color on my brush, so I have quite a watery mixture, and I'm going to start adding a couple more. And you'll see on this side, so this first petal comes straight down, but as I add these ones on either side, they're kind of tilting a little more towards each side. So the petal here will be curving more towards the top right, and the petal here will be curving towards the left. And that just really helps to build in some movement to your painting, and it really helps bring these petals to life, and it makes them look like they're just really blooming open. And I'm not creating these perfect petal shapes here, I'm just letting my brush lead the way, and I'm just going to continue adding. I don't want to add too many petals here, but I want a good amount. Just kind of skirting the edge, and they're not all going to look the same, so this will probably be my last one on the right. Just adding a couple little strokes here that barely even looks like a petal, and I'll do the same thing on the left side. And this is why I really love these Neptune brushes from Princeton. They're my favorite for loose florals. You're probably tired of hearing me talk about them, but they just hold so much water, and it's perfect for creating those beautiful, soft, loose style paintings. So I'm just going in and adding a little more color here and there. I don't want to go overboard, but you can see it starts to create these really organic blooms. You can't control what's going to happen, and quite honestly, that's one of my favorite parts of painting in the loose style. You just have to let go of control sometimes and let it do its thing. And it looks like this petal dried before it got a chance to bloom, so I'm just rinsing off my brush and using some clean water to soften that out because I don't want any hard edges. And my final step is just to do one last layer here of the really dark pigmented mixture, just to deepen that contrast a little bit more. And again, I want to make sure when I go back in to add more layers, I'm not adding too much. I really want to maintain a little bit of white space. If you overwork it, it can really just be a lot easier to turn into a blob, and you lose a little bit of that definition. So do your best to avoid overdoing it, but again, we're just practicing here. You're learning a new technique, so feel free to experiment, and it's completely fine if it doesn't turn out how you like. You have plenty of time to practice. All right, and there is our rose. So now I'm going to practice that one more time. I'll do another one down here, and then at the end we'll add some leaves and greenery. And you can see I have a little bit of paint that spilled here, but that's fine. We can cover that up with greenery later. So again, I'm going to start just with the very tip of my brush and very pigmented paint. And I'll start adding in these wispy little C strokes, making sure to vary the amount of pressure that I'm putting down. Some of them will be thin, some will be a bit thicker, and I'm making sure to keep that nice curve. And also make sure you kind of zoom out every once in a while to make sure that the shape is still a nice circle. Sometimes it can get a little bit wonky, and then it's harder to correct the shape. But now I've rinsed off all that pigment from my brush and just using clean water on my bristles to soften out the edges of these petals. Because again, we want that gradient from the darkest pigment in the middle to lighter values as we work our way outwards. And this style is going to be a little bit looser, so I'm really just letting my brush lead the way. I'm not overthinking where I'm placing these strokes. And then I'll do one final round of very quick loose petals here around the outer edge. And those are the ones that I want to bleed with the skirting petals, so I'm making sure they're quite wet. Alright, and now I'm taking the darker value again and just adding a little bit more here to deepen that contrast in the very center of the rose. And now I can go in and add the skirting petals. So loading up my brush, starting with the tip, and I'm pulling downward, creating these very loose and wispy petals. So I always start with the first one, just pulling straight down, and then I start adding in more and more along the side, and making sure to give a little bit of a curve to them. And you can add as many or as few petals as you'd like on these roses. I usually determine that based on my overall composition, so if I know I want to have some leaves coming out or some filler florals, that kind of helps me to determine where and how many petals I'm going to add around the outside. So I'll just add probably a couple more coming up, and also make sure that you're switching how big your petals are as well. You don't want to have just completely uniform leaves coming out of every single edge. That wouldn't look very realistic. So be sure to mix it up. And then I'm just going in to tap in some additional color. And I think some of these leaves or petals have started to dry, so in that case I'll probably have to just soften out some of those edges, but just trying to work quickly, again, not overthinking it, letting the paint bleed and bloom in its own way. And you just end up with these really beautiful roses. I absolutely love them. And then as the final step, I just add even darker value in some areas and let the paint bleed gently. This is also a great time to practice your water control, because you don't want to go in and add super heavy watery pigment, because then it will just turn into a blob. But you do want to have enough to where you get those gentle bleeds and blooms. So it's really a great opportunity to practice your water control here. So I just encourage you to follow your artistic intuition here and see where it takes you. I also love these Neptune brushes because this is a size 8 brush, so it's pretty big, but you still get a very fine tip, and that's what I love about this brush. I've only ever used one brush in this whole tutorial. It is a size 8, but there's so much versatility. All right, and there we have it. So now let's get started adding some greenery. Typically when I do compositions, I don't recommend working with just 2 flowers. Rule of thirds, I usually want to have an odd number of primary elements, but since we're not doing a composition, we're just learning how to paint these roses, we can just go ahead and add some leaves. So I am going to use that same exact size 8 brush. I've mixed up my favorite green mixture, which is always some sort of sap green, deep sap green, indigo, and then sometimes I add a little bit of brown to give it a more of an earthy tone. And I like to mix up my values. So I'm going to start with a really light value, which means there's more water in the mixture. And I'm just going to apply some pressure down to create this loose, organic looking leaf. And I'll do the same thing right next to it. Again, starting with the tip of my brush and applying some pressure down. Now, while those are still wet, I like to go in and tap in a little bit of a darker value. This is very similar to what we did with the rose petals as well. And just really taking advantage of the wet on wet to create those beautiful bleeds and blooms. And then if you've seen my painting on Instagram, specifically the one that I did of this rose, that's actually what prompted this tutorial. I got so many questions and DMs asking if I could show you how I painted this type of rose, but in that painting, I had a lot of just extra little wispy strokes here. That's what I love to do to add some movement to my floral pieces. And for that, I just used the very tip of my brush. It's still a size 8, but I'm able to get really thin strokes here. And since those two leaves are sticking straight out, I want to add a little more movement, so I just make sure that I give these little strokes a nice curve. And I'm really just alternating with my values. So some of these are a lot lighter, like this one, some of them are darker, and that just really helps to build out some depth. I'm also making sure not to do a perfect leaf shape. I'm doing some movement to my leaf and making sure it has these kind of rough, imperfect edges. I personally love that effect. So I'm going to add one final stroke here, and then I just dab my brush down like this to create these really cute little leaves coming off of this stem. And again, while these are wet, I like to just tap in some darker value and get those really beautiful blooms. And I've said this before in some of my classes, but this is really what I love about loose style watercolor is you can't control exactly what it's going to look like in the end. Even if I wanted to paint this exact piece again, I could make it look similar. I could still paint the same style of roses and try to do the same type of greenery, but it would not look the exact same. You can't control the blooms. You can't recreate the exact things, and I love that. It helps, especially if you're kind of a perfectionist in other areas of your life. I think it's really a great practice to learn how to let go and just appreciate your artwork for what it is and what it chooses to do. But anyways, getting off topic there. You can see that that leaf has already dried, so I didn't get any of that blooming, so I'm just rinsing off my brush and smoothing it out a bit so I don't end up with any harsh edges. And I'll add another leaf coming down here, so you can see I'm just applying some pressure down, wiggling the brush, and you get those really beautiful imperfect edges. So you don't have to follow my exact steps here. You can really just feel free to add any type of greenery that you'd like. Practice some different strokes, use different colors. I'm just kind of making these little dainty marks, and then you end up with really beautiful greenery. So I'll add some on this bottom flower as well. I don't want to make it too crowded up at the top, so I'll just start down here at the bottom, use the tip of my brush, apply some more pressure there, and lift back up. And I usually end up doing 2 strokes, or at least 2 strokes for each leaf, so you get them nice and thick. And always making sure to tap in some of that darker value while it's still wet. So you can see that really beautiful, gentle bleed there. And you're really utilizing your brush in different ways here. So for strokes like these, I'm just using the very tip, and you get nice, dainty, wispy little leaves. And then for these big guys, I'm really applying a lot of pressure and letting the belly of the brush expand across the page. So you can get so many different styles of greenery from one single brush, which I absolutely love. I've, again, only used this one size 8 brush for this entire tutorial for both the flowers and the leaves. All right, and there we have it. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As I mentioned, I do have a full class that's dedicated just to watercolor roses, and that's available online along with several other floral watercolor classes. So you can check that out if you want to keep learning more. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video here on YouTube.